Close your eyes, settle into your blanket, and let your mind drift backward through the centuries, past the electric lamp beside your bed, past the soft hum of modern life, back to a quieter and darker world, a world lit only by candles and hearth fires, where night fell heavy and true, and where the simple act of sleeping was shaped by customs, beliefs, and hardships that feel almost like another planet compared to our own. Tonight, we are going to travel gently through the Middle Ages, that long stretch of European history running roughly from the 5th century to the late 15th century, and we are going to explore, slowly and carefully, exactly how people of that era closed their eyes each night and surrendered to sleep. There is no need to follow every detail closely. Let the words wash over you like a slow river, carrying you toward your own rest, even as we speak of theirs. Let us begin with something that might surprise you, something historians and sleep researchers have pieced together from old letters, court records, medical texts, and diaries. Medieval people did not sleep the way most of us do today. They did not lie down once at night and rise the next morning in one long, unbroken stretch. Instead, for many centuries, it was entirely normal, even expected, for a person to experience what is now called segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. A person would go to bed not long after sunset, perhaps 8 or 9 in the evening, and fall into what they called their first sleep. This first sleep would last 3 or 4 hours. Then, somewhere around midnight, the sleeper would gradually wake, not with alarm, not with worry, but calmly and naturally, as the body simply finished its first cycle of rest. This waking period, sometimes called the watch, could last an hour or even 2. During this quiet middle stretch of the night, people did all sorts of ordinary things. Some prayed. Some talked softly with a spouse lying beside them in the dark. Some tended to a dying fire, added another log, and watched the embers glow. Some visited neighbors, if the neighbors were close and the night was calm. Some simply lay still, thinking over the events of the day, or planning the day to come, half awake and half dreaming, in a state some later writers described as unusually peaceful and reflective. Then, once this watch period passed, they would slip back into what was called the second sleep, drifting off again until dawn's first light urged them to rise and begin the labors of the day. This pattern was so common and so accepted that it appears again and again in old writings, mentioned as casually as we might mention breakfast or a lunch break. Nobody in the Middle Ages worried about this middle-of-the-night waking. Nobody called it insomnia. It was simply the shape that a night naturally took, an accepted rhythm passed down through generations, tied closely to the absence of artificial light. Without electric bulbs to stretch the evening late into the night, and without the modern habit of staying up, scrolling, or watching something glowing on a screen, the medieval body responded to true darkness the way a body naturally does when there is nothing to keep it artificially alert. Some historians believe this same pattern echoes even further back to ancient times before the Middle Ages, and that it likely persisted in various forms right up until the spread of gas lighting and then electric lighting in the 19th century slowly pushed bedtimes later and later, eventually compressing what had once been 2 sleeps into the single stretch that most of us now consider normal. Now let us think about where these people actually rested their heads, because the bed itself in the Middle Ages tells us so much about who a person was, how wealthy their family happened to be, and what kind of life awaited them each night. For the vast majority of people, meaning the peasants who worked the land, farmed the fields, tended animals, and formed the enormous base of medieval society, a bed was a humble thing indeed. Many slept on simple mattresses stuffed with straw, or sometimes with dried leaves, or with hay gathered from the harvest. This straw mattress rested upon a wooden frame if the family was fortunate enough to own one, or sometimes directly upon the floor if they were not. The straw needed to be changed periodically, because over weeks and months it would flatten, grow musty, and attract fleas, lice, and other small, unwelcome guests that thrived in the warm, dark, organic material. Anyone lying awake during their midnight watch in a peasant's cottage might well have felt the itch of a flea bite, or heard the rustle of mice moving somewhere in the corner, sounds so ordinary to that world that they barely registered as disturbing at all. Blankets, for the poor, were often simply the same rough woolen garments worn during the day, repurposed for warmth at night, or perhaps an additional blanket woven from coarse wool if the household could spare the material. Many entire families, parents and children together, and sometimes even farm animals in the coldest months, shared a single sleeping space, huddled close for warmth in homes that had little in the way of proper insulation, chimneys, or glass windows. In the depth of winter, in a small cottage with a single central hearth, warmth was survival, and modesty or privacy simply had to yield to the practical necessity of staying alive through a freezing night. It was not uncommon, especially in colder regions of Europe, for a family to bring a cow, a goat, or chickens into part of the same living space during the harshest months, their combined body heat helping to keep the whole room from turning bitterly cold. Now, let us climb the social ladder a little into the homes of wealthier merchants, minor nobility, and eventually into the grand chambers of lords, ladies, and kings. Because here the story of the bed becomes an entirely different tale, filled with far more comfort, though never quite escaping the discomforts of the age entirely. Wealthy households owned what were called feather beds, mattresses stuffed, not with scratchy straw, but with the soft down and feathers of geese or other birds. These feather-stuffed mattresses were extraordinarily prized possessions, sometimes worth more than most other furniture in the entire house, and they were frequently mentioned by name in wills, passed down carefully from parent to child as a treasured inheritance, evidence of just how valuable a truly comfortable night's rest was considered to be. A grand bed frame, carved from oak or another sturdy wood, might be elevated on a small platform and surrounded by heavy curtains hanging from 4 tall posts. These curtains were not merely decorative. They served several important and practical purposes at once. They kept out drafts in rooms that had no central heating and where cold air crept in through poorly sealed windows and doors. They preserved a small measure of privacy in households that were often crowded with servants, relatives, and visitors moving through the same living quarters throughout the day and night. And they helped trap the warmth of the sleeper's own body heat inside a smaller, enclosed space, turning the bed itself into a kind of small room within a room, a soft, dark cocoon against the chill of the medieval night. Layered atop the feather mattress, a wealthy household might add linen sheets, woolen blankets, and finally a heavy fur or embroidered coverlet on top, sometimes trimmed with the fur of rabbits, foxes, or even more expensive creatures for those at the very highest levels of nobility. Pillows, too, existed for those who could afford them, stuffed with feathers or wool, though many ordinary people simply rested their heads upon a folded garment, a bundle of straw, or nothing softer than their own folded arm. It is worth pausing here to think about who actually shared these beds, because sleeping alone in a private room, the way so many of us do now, would have seemed strange, even wasteful, to most medieval people. Beds were expensive to build and maintain, houses were often small and crowded, and the very concept of individual privacy as we understand it today had simply not yet fully developed in the medieval mind. It was entirely common for parents to share a bed with their youngest children, while older children shared a second, smaller bed nearby, sometimes called a trundle bed, which could be slid underneath the larger bed during the daytime to save space, then pulled out again each evening. Servants in wealthier households often slept in the same room as their employers, sometimes at the foot of the very same bed, ready to attend to any need that might arise during the night, whether that meant tending the fire, fetching water, or responding to a sudden call. Travelers, too, experienced sleeping arrangements that would feel remarkably unfamiliar to us now. Medieval inns, scattered along the roads that connected towns, cities, and pilgrimage routes, frequently required complete strangers to share not just a room, but the very same bed, particularly when the inn was busy and space was limited. A traveling merchant might find himself lying beside a pilgrim he had never met before that evening, and would likely never meet again after the following morning. Both men fully clothed or in simple linen shifts, sharing warmth and a mattress out of pure practical necessity rather than any particular closeness or friendship. This custom persisted for a very long time, and it is a small but telling detail about just how differently people of that era thought about personal space, modesty, and physical closeness with others. Let us speak now of what people actually wore to bed, since this too differed a great deal depending on wealth, climate, and personal habit. Many people, especially among the poorer classes, are believed to have slept completely unclothed, particularly in warmer months, since laundering and owning separate nightclothes was simply an expense many households could not justify. Wealthier individuals, however, increasingly wore a simple garment called a shift or a chemise to bed, a loose, long linen garment that helped keep the finer bedding clean from the natural oils and sweat of the body overnight, since laundering heavy blankets and mattresses was far more difficult than laundering a simple linen shift. Nightcaps, too, became common, especially for men, helping to keep the head warm through the cold hours of darkness in rooms with no heating once the household fire had burned low or been extinguished entirely for safety. And speaking of fire, we arrive at a small but fascinating detail of medieval nightly life called the curfew. The word itself comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning quite literally to cover the fire. In many medieval towns, a bell would ring out each evening, often around 8 or 9 o'clock, signaling to every household that it was time to bank or extinguish the hearth fires for the night. This practice existed for a very practical and serious reason. Fire was one of the greatest dangers facing any medieval town, since homes were built largely of wood, thatch, and other flammable materials, packed closely together along narrow streets, and a single untended flame could burn down an entire neighborhood, or even an entire town, within a single night. So as this bell rang out across the rooftops, families would carefully smother their fires down to a bed of quietly glowing coals, banking the ashes over the embers to keep a small ember alive for the next morning's relighting, while ensuring no open flame remained to threaten the sleeping town. Only then, in the resulting darkness, would most households finally settle down for their first sleep of the night. The very fabric of the night itself carried a heavier weight of meaning during the Middle Ages than it often does for us now. Darkness was, in a very real sense, dangerous. Without streetlights, without any reliable illumination beyond the moon, stars, or a carried torch, the hours after sunset were associated with genuine physical risks, including thieves, wild animals near the edges of towns, and simply the risk of stumbling and injuring oneself on an unlit path. Beyond these practical dangers, the medieval mind, deeply shaped by religious belief, also associated the night with spiritual danger. Many people believed that darkness was a time when evil spirits, demons, or the devil himself found it easiest to tempt and trouble the sleeping and the unwary. Because of this, bedtime prayers were an absolutely essential part of the nightly routine for nearly everyone, regardless of social class. Before closing their eyes, medieval Christians would commonly recite prayers asking for protection through the night, invoking guardian angels, saints, or the Virgin Mary to watch over them until morning, and thanking God for having survived safely through another day. Some households kept a small candle or oil lamp burning through the earliest hours of the night, specifically to ward off both literal and spiritual darkness. Though this was a luxury not every family could afford, given how expensive candles and lamp oil truly were during this period. It is worth mentioning, too, how the very rhythm of religious life shaped sleep for a significant portion of medieval society, namely the many thousands of monks and nuns living in monasteries and convents scattered across Europe. Monastic life followed a strict schedule of prayer known as the canonical hours, and one of these prayer services, called matins, was traditionally held in the deep middle of the night, often around 2 in the morning. Monks would be woken from their first sleep by a bell, rise in the cold darkness, walk to the chapel, and sing or chant prayers for perhaps an hour, before returning to their beds for a second sleep before the dawn service began. In a strange way, monastic life institutionalized and formalized the very segmented sleep pattern that so many ordinary people experienced naturally and informally in their own homes, turning that natural midnight waking into a sacred, structured part of religious devotion. Medieval medicine, too, had a great deal to say about sleep, though much of it strikes the modern ear as unusual, since it was built upon an ancient system of belief called humoral theory, inherited largely from Greek and Roman physicians and adapted by medieval scholars. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 essential fluids, or humors, namely blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and good health depended on keeping these 4 humors in careful balance. Sleep itself was believed to play an important role in this balancing act, helping the body digest food properly and distribute nourishment evenly. Physicians of the era often recommended sleeping on the right side of the body first, believing this position aided digestion by allowing food to settle correctly in the stomach and only later shifting to the left side as the night wore on. Sleeping directly on one's back was frequently discouraged, since some physicians believed it could invite troubling dreams, nightmares, or even more serious ailments. The very timing and duration of sleep was thought to matter too, with most physicians recommending that a person retire not too long after sunset and rise with the sun, following the natural rhythm of daylight rather than fighting against it. since medieval medical thought placed great importance on living in harmony with the natural world and its cycles. Dreams themselves held enormous significance for medieval people, who took them far more seriously as messages, warnings, and omens than most of us do today. Some dreams were believed to come from God, offering guidance, comfort, or prophecy to the faithful dreamer. Others were feared to come from darker sources, sent by demons attempting to tempt, frighten, or mislead the sleeper. Books existed specifically devoted to dream interpretation, attempting to explain what various dream symbols might mean, and ordinary people frequently discussed their dreams the next morning with real seriousness, searching for hidden meaning in the strange visions that had visited them during the night. Let us return once more to the physical world of the bedroom itself, and consider the many small discomforts that filled these medieval nights, discomforts so ordinary to that era that they barely warranted comment, yet which would strike us now as remarkably difficult to endure. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were an almost universal nightly companion, regardless of social class, since even the finest feather beds could harbor these tiny pests within their soft stuffing. Cold was a constant enemy throughout much of the year, since most homes, even grand manor houses and castles, were extraordinarily difficult to heat evenly, with drafts slipping in around windows, doors, and thin stone walls, leaving many rooms bitterly cold except in the immediate vicinity of a fire. Darkness itself, once the household fire was banked and any candles extinguished for the sake of economy and safety, was profound and total in a way that modern city dwellers rarely experience, since there was no ambient light whatsoever from streetlights, neighboring houses, or the glow of distant towns. And yet, within all of this discomfort, difficulty, and darkness, there existed also a kind of quiet, gentle rhythm to medieval nights that feels, in its own way, remarkably peaceful compared to our own modern, hurried lives. There was no glowing screen demanding attention deep into the night. There was no endless scroll of information pulling the mind away from rest. There was simply the fire, the prayers, the quiet murmur of a spouse's voice during the midnight watch, the rustle of straw, the distant sound of a night watchman calling out the hour as he walked his rounds through the sleeping streets, calling perhaps something like all is well, reassuring the town that no fire had broken out and no thief had been spotted lurking in the shadows. These town watchmen, walking their slow and steady rounds through the darkened streets carrying a lantern and sometimes a bell or a horn, were often the only sound breaking the deep silence of a medieval night, their calls marking the passing hours much as a gentle clock might mark the hours for us now, a reassuring, rhythmic presence moving quietly through the dark while the rest of the town slept, woke briefly, and slept again. As the centuries passed and the Middle Ages gradually gave way to what historians call the early modern period, some of these habits began, very slowly, to shift and change. Wealthier households acquired more candles, better hearths, and eventually glass windows that let in a little more light and kept out a little more cold. Yet the fundamental rhythm of segmented sleep, that gentle first sleep and second sleep divided by a quiet waking watch in the deep of the night, persisted in many places for a very long time afterward, only truly beginning to fade away in the centuries that followed, as artificial lighting slowly grew brighter, cheaper, and more widespread, gradually training the human body to compress its rest into the single unbroken stretch that most of us now consider simply, naturally, the only way to sleep. And so, as you drift now toward your own rest, perhaps in a room far warmer and far brighter than any medieval bedchamber could ever have been, spare a quiet thought for all those who came before, wrapped in rough wool or soft feathers, listening to a distant church bell mark the hour, murmuring a quiet prayer against the darkness, waking briefly in the deep hours of the night only to sink gently back, down into sleep once more. Their nights were harder in many ways, colder, darker, and far less private, yet perhaps, in their own quiet midnight watches, they found a stillness that our own bright, busy world has slowly, gradually lost. Let that same stillness settle over you now as your own first sleep, or your only sleep, gently begins.